It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the indelible John Hersey and the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are, indubitably, John Hersey. How you doing this morning, John?
Excellent. Rearing and ready to go today. How are you today?
Oh, I'm great. Had a great Christmas. We had a great time discussing the immortal Sherlock Holmes, and looking
Yes.
forward to New Year's. I'm not looking forward to getting older, but in this case, get 2020 in the rearview mirror, and hopefully 2021 is a much better year with an effective vaccine and everything. Hopefully, so I'm doing well. And we have a real genuine hero of science to discuss today, don't we?
We have an absolute superstar of both history and science and really philosophy of science, Francis Bacon. Excited to talk about Francis Bacon today. It's funny, my neighbor's name is Walter Bacon, and I always wondered, is there any possible relation? But of course we know that Francis Bacon didn't have any kids. So
Yeah. But he might. I'm not sure. You might know. He might have had siblings who had kids. I don't know one way or the other about that. But let's place Bacon historically. He's 15. His dates of 1561 to 1626. So he's growing up during and living most of his life during the Elizabethan era. When Elizabeth I was queen. So it's a tempestuous era. 1588, of course, is the Spanish Armada, right? When John reminds me, as a philosophy guy, because the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes was born in 1588, so he's a later contemporary of Bacon. Not somebody I consider a hero. I don't know who Hobbes on the Hero Show, but Hobbes used, at least he had a sense of humor. Hobbes used to joke that 1588 was a terrible year for Britain because it suffered both the Spanish Armada and his birth. So that at least that at least was
yeah,
was
interesting
funny.
historical connection too. I believe Hobbes was Bacon's secretary for a while.
Oh, is that right? I didn't.
Yeah,
I didn't know that. Well, Hobbes was
friends.
an empiricist. Okay. Well, Hobbes was an empiricist and a philosophic materialist. So one interesting thing about Hobbes, he's 1588 to 1679. That's 91 years. That's a long life at any time. Never mind in the 17th century where they didn't know like anything about medicine, and there were outbreaks of the plague and stuff in the 17th century, as I recall. But anyhow, Bacon certainly is a giant. By the way, I just want to say, if you don't mind, John, I want to say something about one of his black contemporaries, William Shakespeare, because Shakespeare's dates were, what were they, 1564 to 1616, right? Shakespeare died at age 52. Could you? How did he produce the corpus of work that he did in 52 years? Anyway, I just wanted to mention something here in passing because we'll discuss Shakespeare at some point on the Hero Show. Gloomy, pessimistic writer in his best works, his tragedies, but a magnificent poet. He's the Michael Jordan of English literature. He's the GOAT. You know, the greatest of all time, legitimately so. Anyhow, there's been this perverse, John. I'm an old English major, so I know there's this perverse academic game of certain academics who claim that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare's plays, and so they were searching for these learned guys who could have written these brilliant plays, and Francis Bacon's name was one of the ones that that featured prominently. Now, the real Shakespeare scholars who know Shakespeare's life and times and works, they're clear that the plays ascribed to William Shakespeare were written by William Shakespeare. What they say about Newton, the lion by the print of his paw, right? You see Shakespeare's style. But anyhow, I think there's an intellectual snobbery at work here because Shakespeare only had a grammar schooling. That's the only schooling he had. And he went down to London and he was in the theater world. And some of these guys with PhDs from Princeton, they can't conceive of somebody who wasn't as schooled, as they also or some of his contemporaries like Bacon, who had great schooling, and it couldn't conceive of him writing these plays. So I just wanted to uh, debunk that. Francis Bacon did a lot of great things in his life. He didn't write Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare wrote those plays.
Yeah,
Sorry,
and
I'm off on a tangent. Go ahead.
it's doubly absurd given that Francis Bacon led a very turbulent and full life with a political career and only managed to
Right,
eke out his greatest works, which are beautifully written, by the way. They are not written like Shakespeare, but they are beautiful English, very compact, concise, precise. And he only managed to eke those out, though, in the very little amounts of spare time that he had between this and that engagement. I mean, he was constantly torn between his political career and his love of science and philosophy. So
right.
this claim, not that it really requires any response, but it's just pretty absurd.
No, you're right. And after, as we'll discuss, his political career ends ignobly, right, with charges of corruption and everything. But it's good for science because I think it's 5 years from the time he's booted out of his chancellorship position till his death, when he was working on his works in science. But I just want to make one more point here because it ties back to genius. I'm talking about with Shakespeare. Um, we haven't discussed Edison yet either on the Hero Show. We're definitely going to discuss Edison. But remember, Edison was kicked out of the fourth grade, but the headmaster told his mother, that the kid's brain was addled. That's funny. Young Tom Edison brain was addled, and we did the Wright brothers, who made it through high school, and that was the extent of their school. And then Mark Twain himself, like finished fifth grade. There's a whole bunch of examples like that. Shakespeare was a genius, obviously. But the thing I wanted to point out, I was an English major in college. And I remember this old school textbook I found. Somebody was throwing out, and I was reading it. Ayn Rand used to say the older the textbook, usually the better. And this was like early 20th century. It's all gray. The pages were yellow and everything. But this real scholar of English literature was comparing and contrasting Shakespeare with Milton. With John Milton and Shakespeare, two greatest poets in the English language, and the scholars said Milton was this incredible scholar, right? I mean, he knew like 8 languages or something, including dead languages like Hebrew. And the scholar was saying Milton's mind ranged over the world of books the way Shakespeare's mind ranged over the world of men. Now, that is just a brilliant statement because Shakespeare knew human beings. He was down in London, in the big city, working with theater people, and they're living hard. They're in the taverns, and he knew people, and he was a genius. So, that's about one last point on this. The claim is ridiculous because this is the 16th and 17th centuries. This isn't Jesus's time. There were all kinds of people like Ben Jonson. There were all kinds of people who knew Shakespeare personally. They'd go to his apartment one Saturday afternoon. And, what are you working on, Will? I work on a story of this guy who wants to be king, but he doesn't want to murder the king, and his wife pushes him into it. And people who knew Shakespeare, they saw him putting on the plays. That he was expert in telling the actors what to do because he wrote the parts and everything. So it's an intellectual snobbery. I could tie this back to Bacon. Intellectual snobbery, deductive argument. He doesn't have this kind of schooling, therefore couldn't write these kind of plays. That triumphs over induction of actually knowing Shakespeare, what the facts of the people who knew Shakespeare said about him. And Bacon himself here, to tie this back to the subject, if my long tangent, I apologize, John, tie this back to our subject. Bacon himself is famous, right, for extolling and helping to develop the inductive method. So, all right, I'm done with my tangent on Shakespeare. I'm sorry.
No, absolutely. I think we definitely have to do Shakespeare at some point on the show. He was a master psychologist, as you said, and perhaps if he was born in our day, that may be the field that he would have gone into. Um, he's just
He knew people, that's for
brilliant when it
sure.
came to understanding
Yeah,
motivations.
absolutely.
And
Absolutely right.
y- y- you had set the scene a little bit and talking about the Elizabethan age. And there was a poem that I found in Will Durant's chapter on Francis Bacon, where he's trying to convey what it was like at this time. Poem by Roger Ascham, I believe. And Will Durant says that this captures the virtues that were required at Elizabethan court: cog, lie, flatter, and face, 4 ways in court to win men grace. If thou be
Yeah.
thrall to none of these, away, good peers, home, John Cheese. So Bacon had a long political career that stretched from 1583 or 84 to 1621, and he did what he could to win himself favor. It was a very Machiavellian day, and he had a well-connected uncle that he wrote to after leaving, after graduating from law school, and asked for a favor, wasn't given it, and had to work his way up in the field of both law and politics on his own. And each step that he took cost him many years, but he was just so ambitious, so talented, that he made his way up all the way to one of the highest positions in the English government, Lord Chancellor. And as
Right.
you alluded to, he was dismissed disgracefully in 1621, apparently for accepting a bribe. It seems that he probably did. That was a common practice back then, actually. And he knew that if they really pressed the charge, that it would probably stick, and he would get thrown out. So he admitted to it, and walked away. And hallelujah, because it gave him some more time for writing. And he actually said afterwards, why didn't I do this years sooner? I could have done so much more.
Right. Right. His work in science would have been advanced and a less stressful life than the Machiavellian life at court. And I was just wondering philosophically, as you were speaking, anytime you're dealing with I wonder if Elizabeth's court was any different than anybody else's. Anytime you're dealing with a monarch or any type of dictator, doesn't have to be hereditary. And when our late unlamented friend Saddam Hussein was alive, for example, Stalin or Hitler, whatever, Mao, whatever it was, or whoever it was, you would think it would necessarily be Machiavellian. You curry favor with El Duce, Mussolini. You curry favor with the dictator, with the king, with the queen. And Elizabeth, as a ruler, as an absolute ruler, was much better than most. And she's much better than most kings, queens, or dictators. So if it was that Machiavellian, even at her court, you can imagine what it would have been like, being a courtier of sorts for Hitler or Stalin, being in his party and working for him. The kind of infighting, the political knife fights that would go on to make sure that you stand in good graces with the dictator. I can only imagine what it's like. It's no life for me. I want to stay in my bubble, John, and write books. I don't want to get involved with with that kind of
Yeah, and that
stuff.
was Bacon's dilemma as well. He even said at a young age he became an assistant to the English ambassador to France, I think when he was 15 or 16. And he struggled with this question of, do I want a life of politics, or do I want to be a retiring philosopher? But he was of and he really helped to create this enlightenment mind of, no, knowledge has a purpose. The only reason that we need knowledge is to use it. And politicians should be philosophers as well. He sort of almost modeled Plato's philosopher king. He was one of the greatest philosophers of his age and one of the most powerful politicians of his age. And I think you're absolutely right, though, that Elizabeth, by comparison, was a lenient and forgiving ruler. I believe that even after Essex, the Earl of Essex, betrayed her, uh, you know, he led an army in a revolution against the Queen, and at some point, Bacon had spoken so much of Essex and how terrible he was that she asked him to please just stop talking about it. That wasn't what she wanted to discuss anymore. So,
Yeah. Well, she certainly wasn't a mass murderer. I think if I remember my history correctly, she suppressed the Catholics as her father, Henry VIII, did, but not in the way that Oliver Cromwell did in Ireland. Never mind Stalin, Hitler, Mao. Responsible for millions of murders. So no, she was more of an enlightened, monarch than the brutal absolute monarch that Hobbes envisioned, or that we saw later with National Socialism and communism. But uh, with Bacon, so he's born in 1561. Now he's born into an aristocratic family, right? And has a good deal of schooling. When he went to Cambridge or something, like when he was like 14 or something. Is that right?
12. Yeah, his mother was a
12.
linguist, a theologian, and she took it
Oh,
upon
wow.
herself to instruct him. And then, these were his early years. And then when he's 12, he goes to college at Cambridge, which wasn't crazy in those days. It was fairly common, 12, 14 years old. Go to college now, get educated.
Okay. All right. So he comes out of an aristocratic family, has outstanding schooling. His career is divided between politics and science, and also as a writer. You mentioned it, John. And his essays. I remember again, as it comes in handy. Sometimes being an English major. In college, I can remember studying some of Bacon's essays in English lit class, and he was considered an exemplar of what they called, the balanced sentence. His mastery of using the semicolon to connect into independent clauses. And in fact, I have a great quote here from Bacon. I think they'll do that. Does both. Shows us his English prose style, and segues us very nicely into in the inductive method that he was so fond of, and so instrumental in helping to develop. But here's a good quote from Bacon. Quote: For no one successfully investigates the nature of a thing in the thing itself. Semicolon. The inquiring mind. No, I'm sorry. I can't read my own scribble. Semicolon. The inquiry must be enlarged to things that have more in common with. Unquote. So let me repeat that because I botched it. For no one successfully investigates the nature of a thing in the thing itself. Semicolon. The inquiry must be enlarged to things that have more in common with. Unquote. From from Bacon. So you see the beautifully balanced sentence with independent clauses, connected with a semicolon, and of course his philosophy of science. That to understand a thing, you need to integrate. Sounds like Ayn Rand a little bit, or Ayn Rand later sounds somewhat like Bacon. You need to integrate it with other things of that kind. I suppose, for example, we if we want to really understand lions, let's say, or any type of cat, we would need to study, whether it's a house cat or a lion, lions, tigers, but not bears. And then go wider to see how the lion fits into the cat family, right? There's tigers, there's not bears. Yes, so we're integrating and differentiating, as Ayn Rand talks about in her works on epistemology. But we're going broader. Right? We're inducing from
Yeah.
from particulars to broader generalizations.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to rise up to the next level of abstraction to see what the similarities and differences are between different fields. I have another quote here from Bacon. This might even be from the same essay, I'm not sure. But he says, "For as no perfect view of a country can be taken from a flat, so it is impossible to discover the remote and deep parts of any science by standing upon the level of the same science or without ascending to a higher." And you're right. Here he is sort of saying, okay, well, scientific methodology can't be developed only within science. We need to step outside of science and look at the sciences in general. What we need is a philosophy of science in order to say, okay, this is how science ought to proceed, right?
Yeah, yeah, and we need to place Bacon here, in the 16th and early 17th centuries, with his contemporaries, since he went to Cambridge, his contemporaries, the professors who were often derisively referred to as the schoolmen, or the scholastics, and you see this in a lot of the early modern, your early modern thinkers, Bacon, Hobbes, Locke. Uh, I think Descartes too, as I recall, but they're dismissive of the schoolmen who are kind of, often referred to as scholastics, and they're a kind of bastardized Aristotle, version of Aristotle, and they're using a very deductive method. Now Aristotle's famous for developing the syllogism, which is a type of deductive argument. And I guess we should be clear on the distinction between induction and deduction. This is Logic 101, which I teach pretty much every semester. So, induction classically understood is moving from the particular to the general. The old PIG, you know, uh, shorthand form for understanding this, from the particular via induction to the general. So, his Herman the cat is a carnivore, and Seymour the cat is a carnivore, and his Missy the cat, she's a carnivore, and eventually all cats are carnivores based on an inductive process. Whereas deduction is moving from the general to the particular. So if we know that all cats are carnivores, and here's a new cat we've never met before, what's your cat's name? I forget.
Flyer.
What's
But I
your
gave her
cat's
a new name last
Light?
night because I watched Captain Marvel, in which an outer space creature that looks like a cat is actually a flurkin and eats people. So
Oh,
now we call Flyer Flurkin.
a flurkin. A flurkin. A flurkin was a baleful thing, as I recall from Captain Marvel. But yeah, so Flurkin the cat is here's a Flurkin is a cat. If we already know all cats are carnivores, then we can apply that general principle to the new particular. We're moving from the general, so all cats are carnivores. Flurkin's a cat, therefore Flurkin's a carnivore. Uh,
True.
so that's deductive reasoning, and the scholastics were using the syllogism. What's Aristotle's famous example? All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The scholastics were using deductive reasoning, and Bacon, you realized it was sterile. It was they were just they were just reciting Aristotle. Anything Aristotle had said, they treated Aristotle like one of the church fathers. It's like they almost took it on faith. If Aristotle said it, it must be true. And Bacon was one of the great minds. No, 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 no. We're not going to argue from authority. We're not just going to deduce. We're not going to engage in rationalistic speculation. Remember Ayn Rand's great definition of rationalism as deduction without reference to reality. Now we're gonna focus on reality. We're gonna induce from our observation of particulars, and this is part of what makes Bacon such a great philosopher of science.
The way that you put it to me, I recall when I was writing my long profile of John Locke and asked you about the scholastics and about this modern move away from Aristotle. And you said that the scholastics accepted Aristotle's content as dogma, but they rejected his observation based method. And that stuck with me because I think that's just such a great description of scholasticism. It's taking these ideas of Aristotle and putting them into the form of dogma. And what you get is just this disputatious and barren thing. Locke said, and this is true of Bacon, his predecessor, that he was against learned gibberish. What he wanted, what he was after was useful truths, useful knowledge that can be applied to creating human happiness and just creating goods for people to have and to use. So it's funny because we spoke about Sherlock Holmes last week, and I think that this famous quote from Sherlock Holmes captures a lot of what's wrong with scholasticism. He said it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. That's exactly what scholasticism did. In fact, Bacon preceded Arthur Conan Doyle with something almost exactly the same, or at least in the same spirit. He said that having first determined the question according to his will, man then resorts to experience, and bending her into conformity with his placets, leads her about like a captive in a procession. So
Right.
scholastics
You
bent
wonder.
the truth fit their ideas.
Right, and that's exactly right. The Scholastics accepted Aristotle's content as dogma, and they rejected his observation-based method. Exactly right. And I wonder. I don't know. I don't know the answer to this. I wonder how much Aristotle himself was actually taught by the schoolmen. I mean, so when Bacon was at Cambridge, was he actually reading Aristotle? Was he reading, the Aristotle's the posterior analytics? Was he reading the Nicomachean Ethics? Was he reading the metaphysics? I don't know. I don't know if they were actually having the students read Aristotle himself, or if they were just having the students read these commentaries on Aristotle by the Scholastics, and then their deductive claims based on what Aristotle has said. I don't know, but I do know this. One of Bacon's, again, exact contemporaries, Galileo. Galileo's dates were 1564. He's born the same year Shakespeare was, which is, by the way, is the year Michelangelo dies. Galileo was 1564 to 1642, right? And Galileo, who's in a death struggle, with this scholastic mentality, he wants to look through the telescope and actually see the empirical data, and his intellectual foes won't, for various theological reasons. They just quote Aristotle at him, that the surface of the moon must be blah blah blah, and Galileo says, "We look at the telescope and you see it isn't blah blah blah." And Aristotle's mistaken on this, and Galileo is frustrated. Galileo realized, because he said something to the effect that Aristotle, with his observation-based method, would look through the telescope and want to see the empirical data, would change his mind. These guys claim to be Aristotelians, but only in content. They've absolutely rejected his method. I wonder, because Bacon often attacks Aristotle, I wonder if he realized that Aristotle was a kindred soul here, because although Aristotle's famous, and justly so, for developing the syllogism, this exemplar of deductive reasoning, he stressed over and over again, induction comes first. Induction is fundamental. Induction is the foundation of the cognitive edifice. How in the world would we know that all cats are mortal, all cats are carnivores, except through some kind of inductive method? So I don't know if they can realize how much he and Aristotle had in common at the most fundamental level.
I read somewhere that he did appreciate Aristotle and thought that the way that Aristotle was taught and applied was all wrong. But that could be
Okay.
wrong. I'm not sure. But
No, I mean, that could be right.
Yeah,
That
and
could be
hopefully
right.
it is, because that would indicate that he actually did have access to Aristotle's texts and really understood them, and wasn't just rebelling against, a straw man of Aristotle, which is what the scholastics made of him. But their
Right.
method was
Right.
entirely deductive and rationalistic. They'd start with some broad generality and then say, well, this is how the facts should be given this. And they wouldn't actually then take the time to go look at the facts or do the experiment or look through the telescope to say, okay, well, does this actually hold up to the facts? It didn't matter to them. What mattered was disputing this idea with someone else and winning this argument. And that's it. There was no use case for this knowledge.
Right. It reminds me of, John? I saw somebody once distill a determinist argument. The claim that there's no free will, and we're just, we do what we must. That our actions are all dictated by some external force. Distilled one version of determinism to see if I remember. Uh, all material beings act in strict accordance with the law of causality. Man is a material being, therefore man acts in strict accordance with the law of causality. Or you could even make that even more precise or less broad for the determinists, the modern like 20th century determinists. All material beings act in strict accordance with the laws of physics. Man is a material being, therefore man acts in strict accordance with the laws of physics. Now there's rationalism, par excellence. And this is the kind of excuse me, this is the kind of invalid, or I should say unsound, purely theoretical and purely deductive reasoning that Bacon justly and properly bridled against. This is what he was opposed to. And Aristotle was certainly opposed to it, but Aristotle did not have at his disposal uh, and didn't come up with the idea. I'm not knocking Aristotle. This is we did a show on Aristotle where we, I think, justly and properly said he was the individual who more than anybody in history taught human beings how to think, or at least he attempted to. The proper method, a lot of human beings haven't understood it yet. But the experimental method wasn't developed in the ancient world, not by Aristotle or anybody else. It's the part of the essence of modern science that's enabled modern science to make such advances. And Bacon, is there anybody more instrumental to the development of the experimental method than Francis Bacon?
I don't think so. I mean, there were people that were practicing it to some extent and showing what fruits it could bear, but they were few and far between. And really, what science lacked was a a philosophy of science. It lacked a systematic overview. Okay, this is what we should be after, and this is how we should go about getting it. And I think, one of the most important things that Bacon did was he started his whole program with, okay, there are certain fallacies of thinking that are very common, and we need to be on our guard against these sorts of inductive fallacies, the same that we need to be on our guard against logical fallacies. And he called them idols. He had 4 different idols, but I really think that he captured many different ideas with these. You have to guard against, for instance, the idols of the tribe, these things that are we are prone to do just by our own human nature. He said human understanding is of its own nature prone to suppose the existence of more order and regularity in the world than it finds. So we're prone to simplify, to say, well, it appears that the planets all orbit in perfect circles, even though observation shows that not to be the case. We're prone to prejudice. We're prone to confirmation bias. We have these cherished beliefs, and if we don't examine them really closely, it's likely that some of these beliefs are not actually true. So we have to really take seriously any negative instances, anything that tends to disprove our generalizations. Um, there were there was the idol of the cave. This idea that people take a lot of what they do for work and analogize it to everything else, or a lot of what they do, a lot of their experience in life, they tend to oversimplify and apply that to things that it doesn't really apply to. For a politician, everything comes down to votes and constituencies, and they could look at a different field and think of it in terms of what they're used to in their own experience. A sailor could analogize things in completely different fields as being, everything comes down to currents and bearings and loads of a ship and things like that. So you want to pick up with the other idols, Andy?
Well, I would if I remembered them, John. But
Oh,
the but no, it's been a long
just a
time
couple.
since I studied. I know there were four. There were four idols, right? What were the other two?
So there's also the idols of the marketplace. And this
Right.
is so interesting because I think he really anticipates Rand in some ways. You mentioned Ayn Rand earlier. Well, he
Yeah.
he said that we tend to get our conceptions from our conversations with other people. And a lot of times we come up with these words, and the words are meaningless. We have a lot of loaded language. And he had no shortage of this to pull from Aristotelian scholasticism. You know, and even things that were actually in Aristotle, like unmoved mover, or some of the concepts that were then popular in alchemy. That he said that these words really don't have any meaning, and when we try to use these words, they really blight our understanding. You know, our notions have to come from reality. You know, all the truths that we know and accept come down to words and generalizations. And if our words don't actually reflect the facts, then the things that we're saying don't reflect the facts. And then lastly, there are the idols of the theater. And these are all the various philosophic systems that had been developed. And he thought, by and large, if not 100% of them, were just bullocks. They were, he said, all the received systems of philosophy are but so many stage plays representing worlds of their own creation after an unreal and scenic fashion. So, you know, Plato's system really said more about who Plato was as a person than it did about the world as it is. And I think he may or may not have thought that, well, the same applies to Aristotle and to Epicurus and to all of the others as well. So, you know,
You know,
he
yeah. The
go ahead.
two things occurred to me while you were speaking, John. One was an economist I know who's well known. I won't mention his name, but he was talking once in a social gathering about marriage, and he went off on one. Well, so the man and the woman calculate how much it would take to live together, and how much what they would have to buy, and his wife said, "Stop." She said, "Stop. That's not that's not the way people look at marriage." And she was kind of sheepish. She said he does this all the time. He looks at things strictly from an economic standpoint. So as an example, that was the idol of the cave, right? Seeing things from within the parameters of exclusively from within the parameters of your own profession, seeing things in the cash value, the dollars and cents value, and the other thing that occurred to me when you were speaking, what's that, John? That's a
I
good
said
example
exactly.
of
As an economist.
yeah. Right. Another thing occurred to me when you were speaking was about alchemy was Newton. I mean, here's Newton, the greatest scientist. Bacon's obviously right about this. Here's Newton. We did a show on him as we should as the greatest scientist of history. And Newton comes 80 years later, right? Newton's dates were 1642 to 1727. He's born in the year Galileo dies. At 80 years later, he's the greatest scientist of history, still a fervent practitioner of alchemy. So Newton may have been led to various mystical elements because he was a devout Christian of some kind. But anyway, Bacon is right on this, and Newton was mistaken. By the way, was Bacon especially religious? I don't know the answer to that question. Was he's such an empiricist? What was his views on religion? You know?
Well, he tends obviously toward a scientific rationalism in most of his writings, but he definitely professed a belief in Christianity and thought he said something to the effect that if slight philosophy will turn a man's mind toward atheism, but a deeper view of philosophy will turn it back toward religion. So
Okay,
he was
that sounds like
nominally religious. I don't think he was. He wasn't like Joseph Priestley or some of the other, like William Wilberforce, some of these other um, true heroes that we've talked about on the show, but that were extremely devout, or Isaac Newton, like you mentioned.
right. Yeah, we mentioned Thomas Hobbes before, who was a philosophic materialist, meaning all things are matter. There's nothing but matter. One thing I could say for materialism, the only thing I could say in favor of it is it's simple. Everything's matter. There's nothing else. So to be consistent with that, there's no spirituality. That's just a superstitious legacy from the past. So there couldn't be any God. But Hobbes certainly professed Christianity. But of course, as his biographers point out, the Puritans, Hobbes died in 1679. The Puritan Revolution was 1640s, and Oliver Cromwell comes to power. And to openly embrace atheism, Hobbes may well have professed Christianity in order because he had this quaint idea he wanted to keep his head attached to his shoulders, you know. So, but but Bacon sounded like he believed, although not fervently, like you said. Uh, all right, so we should say something about the experimental method because
Absolutely.
because oh my God, I teaching logic these poor kids, John. These American college students, and I want to say a lot of professors they don't like the kids. They make that very clear to me when we're discussing in private. I like the kids, before and after class, I talk to them. We talking about sports or movies or music, and stuff. They're good kids. They're good American kids, but they come out of high schools and they don't know anything. you know, we did a show on James Madison. And I think I mentioned this. I had 20 kids in class. The arithmetic was simple. 10 of them 50%. I never heard of him. Never heard of the man who was lead author of the U.S. Constitution and virtually the sole author of the Bill of Rights. No, they don't know any history. Many of them struggle just to read. Can't write a college level essay. And, I asked them about the experimental method in logic class. And they've taken science courses of some kind in high school, but it must be so diluted and watered down. They don't know anything about the experimental method. So I use a simple example. I was always a cat lover, so I use cats as an example. They claim all cats are carnivores. Back in Aristotle's day, Aristotle was a big induction guy. How would you validate that? It can only be by what they call simple enumeration. Here's a cat, there's a carnivore, there's a cat, here's a carnivore, and you're good. But the problem with that is there's billions of cats in the world. And by the time you exhausted the whole litany of cats, 50 million others would have been born, and you have to test them, not to mention all the cats in the past and all the cats to come in the future. So it's hopeless. Simple enumeration is hopeless, right? But the experimental method, you probably do this with 1,000 cats, maybe less. You have like 500 cats of every type. Male cats, female cats, young cats, middle-aged cats, old cats, little house cats, lions, tigers, big 750-pound Siberian tigers today, and you have each, every type in both groups. One group you feed meat, one group you put on a vegetative diet and you watch. And the cats on the meat diet flourish, right? The kittens are playful, they grow, and during mating season, the adult cats have an interest in sex and, so on. Whereas the cats on the vegetative diet, they lose weight. Now, they'll eat the vegetables, but, they're hungry enough, they'll eat it. But they lose weight. The kittens don't grow. They're listless, no interest during mating season. And you don't want to hurt the cats, so you put them back on a meat diet, and within a few days or a week, you see the weight back on. They have more energy. The kittens are playing again, and they're growing. And you realize, cats will eat vegetables, but they can't digest them. They can't gain any sustenance. They need to on a meat diet in order to gain sustenance. They're not omnivores. They're carnivores. And out of the billions of cats in the world, you could do that with like 1,000 cats, probably fewer. And there's the genius of the experimental method. It enables you to establish these broad inductive claims by surveying a very limited number of members of the class. So the experimental method is obviously a huge cognitive step forward for mankind's acquisition of knowledge. That's a
Yeah.
simple example I use in class.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, no. I didn't know you weren't finished. Go ahead.
Oh, that's a simple example I use in class because most of these poor kids come out. It's just heartbreaking. They come out of the American high schools, and there's some exceptions. There's some exceptions. There's some very good students, who not just smart and rational, but they've had training. They've had some schooling. But I don't know, 80%, let's say, they're lost. They're just cognitively lost. That's why I'm writing a book on education. It's important to get this out to that's written for the parents. Well, it's based on my essay in TOS. So it's heartbreaking. But that's the example that I use in class, and I think it's simple enough that the kids understand there's something about an experimental method.
Yeah, Bacon obviously is most famous for having said nature to be commanded, sorry, must be obeyed. And what he said was that the scholastics and others, what they tried to do was anticipate nature. They tried to say, okay, well, this is what we think is going to happen. They didn't really look. And he said, what we need to do is we need to interpret nature. We need to go to nature and look at things and figure out, let's go, like you said, let's use the inductive method. Let's go from individual observations and build upon those to greater and greater generalizations. And only after much time can we say that we've established anything like a general law. But he said that we can't just observe. We have to supplement observation. Observation alone is not going to get us where we need to go. What we need is experiment. So we need to put nature on the rack and demand its secrets.
I like it.
Can only do this by designing the experiments that will offer up the observations that we need to say, okay, this thing is universally true. And part of this method, I think that this is really interesting, was that he said that we should write down all the similarities and differences between like and unlike phenomena. So let's put an example that is not very clear on its own. What's this method of similarity and difference? Well, in 1749, Benjamin Franklin used exactly this method in investigating whether or not lightning was electricity. He said, well, electricity and lightning, how are they similar? How are they different? And he listed all the ways in which they were similar. He said things like they're both attracted to points and both seem to have some relation to water and uh, several other observations. And what this allowed him to do was to sort of hone in on what are the causal factors involved. What are the things that when I vary this thing over here also varies? And sometimes it's inversely proportional, sometimes it's directly proportional. So the Baconian method, though, there were several steps to it, and much of it was quite cumbersome. He said that we have to create these long lists of observations under different heads, and it takes he basically stressed that it takes a lot of information to get to any sort of true generalization. And some people took this too far. I think early in John Locke's career, for instance, he was so skeptical of any sort of hypothesis or broad abstraction. And I think to a fault even. And it wasn't until after 1689 when Newton published his Principia that he was able to see that a scientific method could actually establish these broad principles, that we could actually have principles that show us how nature works. So there was this anti-hypotheticalism, anti-hypothesis. Let's not have any hypothesis here. Let's just go by the facts. Well, I don't think that Bacon was necessarily against hypotheses. I think that his works actually, part of his method, in fact, encouraged people to formulate a hypothesis at some point in order to cordon off what it was you were testing. But by and large, it was Bacon's method that helped uh, helped uh, catalyze the scientific and industrial revolutions. You see this in the Royal Society, for instance, that cited Bacon as one of its main inspirations. Bacon said that not only do we need science, which is this organized body of knowledge, we need organization around science so that when this person who has all this knowledge someday dies, they don't, take with them all the accumulated knowledge that they've gathered. We need organizations, we need societies, we need journals, we need for institutions of higher learning to divide up the scientific field between them and get to work. We need this division of labor in the sciences so that we're not all wasting our time on the same thing and we're not losing the progress that has been made in the past. So I think the Baconian method, in some respects, is not one that's really gained that much traction because it's a little bit cumbersome to list all of these known observations about these various things. But in essence, it's all true, and it's just it just so happens to be the case that a lot of times in science we have these observations that allow us to go a little bit further on the basis of a little bit less. And in fact, Bacon even foresaw this. He said that science itself would revolutionize its own method as scientists gained greater and greater experience with the method. And so he knew that even his own observations on scientific method would someday be outdone, and they were. He wasn't wrong about that, but they couldn't have been outdone if he hadn't set the groundwork.
Laid the foundations. That's definitely true. And there's such a thing, I think, and Bacon was good at this as a healthy skepticism. I mean, skepticism as a epistemological theory is just false. The idea that human beings can't gain knowledge of the world. That's that it's like we can't know anything, and I know that. There's a
Yeah.
it's not just a contradiction there, but it's obviously false because I know what time I got. I know what time I got up this morning. I know what I had for breakfast this morning. I know where I am right now, where I'm living. There's all kinds of things we know that we know obviously. But so that's theory is just epistemologically false. But the kind of healthy skepticism that Bacon had is that we don't accept any hypothesis until and unless we've shown that it's supported by a great deal of evidence. Then as skepticism is obviated. There's no need to doubt it. Can go back to the cat's example. If I see I'm in India and then there's a tiger, coming down towards me and he's licking his chops and everything, I don't have to doubt that he's a carnivore, and I also don't have to doubt that I'm meat, So hopefully make this a happy ending. I have a great big gun, a great big rifle, and I pointed at him and to make this a happy ending for the tiger as well. Well, animals often run away. Bam, bam, shoot in the air, and the tiger runs away, and I don't get eaten. So at a certain point, we have sufficient evidence to know that cats are meat eaters, tigers are cats. I'm meat. We have the evidence to support that. There's no need to doubt it anymore. So yeah, I think Bacon's spirit there is absolutely right. Skepticism about any hypothesis until unless it's supported by a great deal of evidence.
Yeah, exactly. He thought we needed a healthy skepticism, and you see this echoed later in Descartes, to some extent in Locke and several other thinkers, that we need to start with some bit of skepticism. We need to question the foundations of what we've learned in the past, because obviously some of this stuff has led us astray. But Bacon said, if a man will begin with certainties, he shall in doubts. He will be content to begin in doubts. He shall end in certainties. So he wasn't a full-on skeptic. In fact, he was an anti-skeptic. He was an anti-Humean. He wasn't a contemporary of David Hume. He was a century before, but he obviously there were skeptics before, and he thought, well, yeah, there are some similarities in where we start, but there's a great deal of difference in where we end. I end providing useful knowledge to mankind, or the scientific method ends by producing useful knowledge for mankind, whereas skepticism says that there's no such thing. We can't have knowledge. So yeah, there's this great difference in the type of skepticism, but there is a bit of healthy scientific skepticism when you start. Like, don't just take things without evidence.
Right, exactly. It's a perfect example of that in recent years was the great American astronomer Carl Sagan, who unfortunately died young, from cancer. But he's famous for the Cosmos series. Was most widely viewed science series, I think, in the history of TV. But Sagan, was instrumental in the SETI program. The SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which I always thought, be careful what you go searching for. And I just hope we find the American aliens, not the German aliens. But anyhow, anyhow, so his a big part of his Professor Sagan's career, I think he was a professor at Cornell. I think big part of his career was, he was emotionally invested in SETI. It was a big part of his career was the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And so some journalist asked him at one point. He said, "Professor Sagan, gut feeling, is there intelligent life in outer space?" And Sagan responded, "I don't think with my gut." But is that perfect or not? I mean, in effect, I want this hypothesis to be true. I'm all invested in it, but I don't have any evidence, and my gut feeling is not evidence. Right? We need evidence to one way or the other to validate or invalidate the hypothesis about intelligent life in outer space. I think Bacon, yes, Professor Sagan. You're exactly right. I think Bacon would approve.
Absolutely. He definitely would. In fact, he said, the more you want something, the more you should suspect. The more you want something to be true, the more carefully you should investigate the evidence for it. And obviously, you should investigate all evidence carefully. But the point is, yeah, suspect the things that you want to be true even more, and investigate them even more deeply. Don't just follow your gut. That's not a means of
Yeah.
thinking.
When you're emotionally invested in Proposition X, it's easy to interpret any data, in support of it. You got to be really, really, wedded to the facts then, an objective, and to an objective method, an objective analysis. Now, Bacon is knowledge is power is another great Baconism. Knowledge is power, and when we reflect that there's power to do good and there's power to do evil, I think we can say with the scientific method, there's the power to do so much good here. We based on the scientific method, we made so many advances in so many different fields: theoretical science, applied science, and one of those fields, of course, is vaccinology. And hopefully, we have an effective vaccine soon. It sounds like we do. Based on a sound scientific method. And again, kudos and thanks, gratitude to Francis Bacon for being one of the giants upon whose shoulders, to quote Newton here, on whose shoulders we stand. Regarding the development of scientific methods. So he's certainly a worthy subject of the hero show, John.
Absolutely. And this last point reminds me that one of his last books was The New Atlantis, in which he discusses what a future of great scientists could possibly look like. And there are these explorers, and they come across this unknown land, and it's this island, and they discover in time that these people are ruled by a technocracy in a sense. Like all of their politicians, they're not really like politicians at all. They don't do political things. They do experiments, and they look for knowledge, and they try to make life as good as it can be. I don't think that there's much merit to this idea of technocracy, but Bacon also didn't think that there should be much government in the future world of science. And right now we're seeing quite the opposite of that. We're seeing what happens when the scientists are strapped down by their government, not empowered by it, and it's pretty frightening. Um, you know, why couldn't this vaccine? Uh, why couldn't the process of this vaccine is going through? Obviously, it's being sped up, and some of the red tape is being removed or pushed out of the way for now. But why isn't that always the case? And why is it that our politicians are doing so much when they should be doing so little?
Right. You have to get the FDA out of the way in order to, in order to get a vaccine or to have, the Food and Drug Administration, anybody in a different country, in order to get a vaccine or to get, various medicines out on the market. They have all just tons of red tape that they put in the way of the pharmaceutical companies. That, yeah, people die. I mean, what was the example with the baby aspirin? Back, I think that went back to the 1980s. If I remember correctly. The I think the research had established for somebody who had a heart condition that, a baby aspirin every day helped your heart, and helped obviate the possibility of a heart attack. I think that had been established in the medical journals, but by the research. And so Bayer aspirin wanted to advertise that, and the Food and Drug Administration said no. You can't advertise it. We don't know the side effects, or whatever. So years more research, before they let the aspirin companies, advertise that fact. So now the doctors, of course, who knew this were certainly free to tell their patients take a baby aspirin, but a lot of people didn't know that. A lot of people, very likely, a lot of people died of heart attacks over those years of additional research. Not just the cost of it, to the pharmaceutical companies, but the cost in human life. How many people died in those intervening years who possibly could have been saved if Bayer, had been permitted to advertise. So, um, placing all these governmental agencies and laws and regs in the path of scientific research, and then using the research. Bacon was all about useful, science, science for use, right? Science to promote human life. Well, yeah, we need to. One point is, in the semi-free countries like the United States, we need to get the government out of the way of science and applied science, including medical research. And then maybe even scarier is in the totalitarian states. To the extent that science is conducted at all, it's all for purposes of, military expansion and aggression. To develop weapons of war, like we see in China today. We saw in Japan in the build-up to World War II. We saw Nazi Germany and the Soviets. The only science the Soviets permitted, was the space program, for example, was ultimately going to be used for military purposes. So, yeah, yeah, science in the hands of government, especially totalitarian states, but even semi-free societies, is not conducive to human life.
Absolutely. Well,
So,
Bacon said that, he said that he wanted to die in the earnest pursuit of some scientific endeavor, and he actually did. You probably heard the story. He died when he was like 54, I believe, because he had the hypothesis that freezing meat would stop decomposition, and
right.
so he was on his way to a friend's house. He bought a chicken and stuffed it with snow, and apparently caught a cold and died a few days later. So people
You have
say it was
pneumonia,
pneumonia.
right?
Yep.
Right. Right. 1561 to 1626. So that's even. So he was 65. I'd read that. I'd read the story, that he had exposed himself to, in pursuit of this experiment. He had exposed himself to really terrible weather, and caught a cold, and died of pneumonia. So that's literally true. That's not some kind of myth.
Yeah, some sources present this as apocryphal, but the more I looked into it, the more I saw that confirmed it. I mean, even in Bacon's own letter to the friends whose house he was staying at, he got there and his friend wasn't there, so he wrote him a letter and he told him what he had done. It's also confirmed in a letter by the friend who he was traveling with. So it seems to be
Okay.
the case that this is actually what happened. And I guess the big question is, okay, was it causal? There's certainly a correlation here. He was out in the cold. He stuffed this chicken full of snow. He said he was cold after that, never really shook it, and he died a few days later. So it seems like there was a connection there, but we need science. We need a bit more science to say with certainty that that's what killed him, but it does seem that way. And in any case, he did die as he had wished in earnest pursuit of new knowledge.
Right. Right. Reminds me when we would talk about Darwin, and the dangers of, scientific research, biological research, in some of these tropical islands when you're wading through swamps in search of, some plant life or something. There's alligators and everything, whatever. There's dangers, at times in scientific research. And I think I mentioned at the time, but didn't some famous glaciologist just die recently, like in the last year or so in Greenland? I guess research in the earnest search for knowledge slipped into a crevasse or something and died. I think that was just in the last year. So we need to salute, John, the courage of these great scientists who you know put their lives on the line in search of knowledge and sometimes die in the earnest pursuit of scientific knowledge. It sounds like Bacon was one of them.
Absolutely,
So
he did, of course, more to methodize or to systematize scientific method than he did to actually add to the content of science. But what he did was incredibly important to the advance of science. I don't think we would have had the world that we have today if not for him.
right. So I think we salute Francis Bacon, a true hero, and all the heroes of both practical science or science practice and the philosophy of science, where Bacon excelled. So once again, one last time, I'm going to salute Francis Bacon. Thank you, Sir Francis Bacon, and John. And everybody out there in Hero Land, I'm going to wish you to have a more heroic day. And of course, since next time we're going to be on the air, will be in 2021, have a heroic 2021. I hope it's a lot better for everybody than 2020 was. But if we're the heroes of our own lives, then we carry on and make our lives better, even in the midst of a pandemic. So have a heroic day, everybody.
And a more heroic 2021. See you soon.